Hi everyone, my name is John Doherty, and in today's video I'm going to be showing you how to set up authentication with your Django REST project, and I'm also going to be using Next.js for the front end of my web application. Auth0 will allow my Django REST API to communicate with my Next.js front end web service, and I'm also going to be using a provider called Auth0. Auth0 is a pre-built authentication framework. It can speed up the development process of a new product you're working on. Provides stuff like login, log out, password reset. You can implement role-based authentication. All that stuff's fairly easy to add on to a project. It's very light touch. Another great benefit as well with Auth0 is that it has quite a large variety of supported frameworks and libraries. So you could be using Ruby on Rails, for example, or you could be using another web-based framework. It could be Java Spring, for example. It has quite a lot of out-the-box support with a wide range of web frameworks. In today's video, I'm also going to be covering a thing called role-based authentication. So a role would represent a kind of stakeholder. So you might have a staff role, you might have a receptionist role or a doctor role, or just a role represents some kind of stakeholder, and a role has a certain set of permissions associated with that. So a doctor might have 10 different permissions that would be different to another role. And with this role-based authentication, it allows for your backend to check if there's certain permissions present for a particular user, and you can accept or deny certain API requests based on the scopes that they obtain, essentially. That's just a quick overview, and I'm going to jump in now into the infrastructure as well behind the project and how it's all fitting together. So I'm just going to give you a quick overview of the project infrastructure. I'm going to be walking through quite a lot of code in this video. You can follow along. Here is a link to the repository. I'll include a link in the video description as well. And make sure you don't forget to like and subscribe as well. So before we dive right into authentication implementation, I'm just going to give you a quick overview of the system in itself. So this is a product that I've built previously in the past. It's called a health app demo on GitHub. And the purpose of this product is to allow patients to book doctor's appointments, essentially. And if you're a patient, you'll have the ability to submit your symptoms, and then a receptionist at the local hospital would have the ability to triage and prioritize who gets seen first, basically, depending on the person's symptoms. If you wish to view more details about this product, feel free to check out my previous video called How to Build a Health App. So this is just a quick overview of the infrastructure. All these diagrams are inside the GitHub repository. Feel free to check it out in your own time. So this is what things are actually looking like, where I have 3 web applications. So one is for the patient to submit their symptoms and to view the status of their appointment request. One is the staff application. So if you are a receptionist or a doctor and you wish to view the booking request details and the triage a patient, you would do that within this web application. And then we also have the internal web application. So this is what someone within the company would use to view statistics on how the product is being used, and also to onboard new customers onto the product as well. So we have these 3 web applications, and each application will represent a client on our Auth0 setup. And we also have our own REST API, which will be sitting here, and all of these web applications will be communicating with this one REST API. So the REST API will need represented in Auth0 as a resource server. So we'll have 3 clients, and we'll have one resource server. And each of these clients will need permission to communicate with this resource server. And we will also be implementing a thing called role-based authentication, as I've previously mentioned. So we're going to have two roles set up here, one called patient and one called staff. The patient role will have a set of permissions such as the ability to submit an appointment, the ability to view appointments, the ability to cancel a booking, stuff like that. And the staff role will have the ability to, have more advanced permissions such as triaging appointments, managing calendars, stuff like that. So that's just a kind of quick overview of our project setup. And it's also important to note that this patient app would be more consumer facing, but the staff application would be more kind of business orientated. So if you are running a hospital, you will want the ability to create an organization, and an organization would have multiple members within it. So this staff application will have a slightly different authentication process because it is operating with the organization mindset, and an organization will have multiple members, and you can also invite members to join an organization as well. So that's just a kind of quick overview of the infrastructure, and now we'll start to kind of dive into what the code is actually looking like and how to set up your Auth0 account. So currently on screen I have a Terraform configuration file. So Terraform is a programming language created by HashiCorp. It basically makes things easier for managing server infrastructure resources. Everything in this Terraform file can also be done through the Auth0 web application. So don't feel like you have to use Terraform if you don't want to. You can do it all through the web app as well. And it's just a personal preference. I find Terraform easier to manage authentication. I think authentication can be quite intricate at times, and there can be a lot of dependencies, and state of things can go out of sync. So I personally find Terraform just makes that whole process of managing authentication in a production environment that wee bit easier. So I have a resource server defined here that I previously mentioned, and this is for my REST API, and I've declared a bunch of configuration within this resource block. The important thing to note here is that I'm setting offline access. This is flagged as true, and what this allows for is for the ability to create refresh tokens and to exchange a refresh token for a brand new access token. So an access token is a small basically blob of randomly generated text that you include in the header of your HTTP requests, and those tokens expire after a set period of time. So depending on the web application, you can just immediately log out a user, or you can go through the refresh token process to continue to extend that user session, and they don't have to constantly log in or log out to access the application. So I'm just saying here that this is true because I want to allow for refresh tokens to work essentially. I've defined two roles in here as well. So I have a patient role and I have a staff role. And I've also defined a collection of permissions that belong to the staff role. So a staff role gets more permissions than a patient, and this is just what these permissions actually look like. I'm just saying that this is the name of the permission and it belongs to that resource server that I've declared above. And then the same again for the patient, it's just a subset of the permissions for the staff role, and then the exact same process, just a list of permissions. Another thing to note as well is that I previously mentioned that on this staff web application, it has that organization setup. So in here, I'm declaring the configuration for the organization login process here. So if you are a staff member in a hospital, multiple staff members of that hospital will have the ability to log into that web application, and there'll be certain resources associated with an organization, and you could even onboard multiple hospitals if you wanted to quite easily. And I've also declared in here the refresh token configuration here too. So all my Auth0 configuration is just all within this file, and then now I'm going to show you basically how I've set up my Next.js and how I access those access tokens and how I include it as part of the request going to my API. So I'm just going to give you a quick demo of the authentication working for my staff web application now. So if I navigate to a URL within my staff web application, which is this one, for example, on screen, because I'm currently logged out, I should be immediately prompted to log in order to access certain web pages. So if I go here, you can see that I'm being prompted to log in order to access this web application locally. So with Auth0, you also have the ability to style your login screen, so you can change colors of things about, you can add in a custom logo, or you can even change the domain. So here it's giving me this kind of ugly looking good as part of the URL, but you can reroute that authentication to a subdomain on your own domain essentially. So I'm just going to go ahead, I'm going to log in, and then I'm going to show you the configuration for the Next.js web application communicating with my Django REST API. So I've just clicked the sign in button, and I am being redirected to the URL that I tried to initially access, and you can see that the authentication process has worked. I have the ability to now just play about with the staff web application. You can see there's a bunch of patient requests coming through. If we also take a look at the server logs, so I'm using Docker Compose, and I'm running all these servers locally. But you can see all these requests are coming back with a 200 response. So if the user wasn't authenticated and they didn't have the access token within the header, this Django REST API service would respond with a 401 or a 403, just telling the user that they need to log in first before accessing any resources on the REST API. So I'll show you the code now for my my Next.js web application. So I'd just like to remind you that you can access all this code on the GitHub repository. So this is the Next.js file for the appointments page that we were looking at a second ago. So this page here, and we are inside the staff web application. So after the user has logged in, we will have the ability for requesting an access token, which we can then include as part of our Django REST API header. So in order to get an Auth0 token, I've created a custom method to do that. So I have first declared that in order to access this page, that page authentication is required. So if the user isn't logged in and they try to hit the URL, they'll be immediately redirected to the Auth0 login page, and then after successful login, they'll be redirected back to the original page. So after the user has logged in, I'm then going to request a token for the page to load, and this is just a custom method that I have implemented. So a lot of these methods would originate from the Auth0 Next.js library that's available on GitHub, and it's open source. You can feel free to check it out on the GitHub repository. But I've just slightly extended it myself, just on my own needs. So with page token is essentially just a wrapper around the get server side props on Next.js. So I'm just saying that I'm going to request an access token via the Auth0 Next.js library. And then if the request for the access token is unsuccessful, so sometimes this method may raise an exception, And if you click into it, you can see all the different reasons why there might be an exception. So, you know, the user doesn't have a valid access token. It could be expired. There could be insufficient scope. There's just a litany of reasons why it might not work. But if there's any exception raised in the process, I'll just redirect the user to the URL to log back in, essentially, and then redirect back to the original page. And then if it is successful, then I will continue on with the original get server side props method. So I'm just essentially providing a wrapper around that function, and I can access my token in here. So here I have a get appointment states method, and this is what is communicating with my Django REST server. So I pass in my token here. Here is the URL for my REST API. And this is, you know, coming from an environment variable. And in here, I'm saying as part of the headers for the request, authorization is the name of the header, and it's going to contain the value bearer and the access token that we requested a second ago from the Next.js front-end, you know, web application. So that's a kind of, you know, high-level overview of how I'm getting a token and how I'm enforcing the page authentication on my Next.js web application. And then now I'm going to show you how things are working on the back end with my Django REST application. So I'm now just giving you a high-level overview of how the Django project is authenticating the user. So I have defined a custom permission class that certain views might, you know, utilize. So I've got a permission for patients, I've got a permission for staff members, and you can also tailor if the permission is for read-only access or read-write, depending on the circumstance. So each time a request comes in for certain views, what will happen is that the contents of the request will be kind of scrutinized, where the access token will be extracted, decoded, and then the scopes associated with that token will also be determined. So if I take a look at this process actually happening now, so in the case of this method here, get request metadata, so what I'm saying here is I'm going to get the authorization header, I'm going to extract out the token, I'm going to decode the token and extract out the organization ID if it's a request from the staff web application, but the organization ID might not be present for a patient web application request. So I have to handle both scenarios. And as part of this decoding process, this is a logic that has been provided by Auth0 themselves on their official Django REST framework guidance. But you need to provide a certain set of variables, so the identifier being used, the domain, and then also some keys as well in order to decode the contents of these tokens going back and forth. So this is essentially my REST API determining if the request is valid or not. So in your settings PY, there is a section specifically for the JWT authentication. And you can see it in here, JWT auth. I'm specifying that I've got a custom handler that we were looking at a second ago. And I'm also stating that if I want to extract out the username, you know, that's the method for doing it essentially. So this is how I kind of identify, does the user exist within our Django application. So, you know, feel free to check out this logic on the GitHub repository. But one of the main things I want to get across as well is the scopes. So I have this method, which is a decorator called required scopes. So if I take a look at a view in here, if I go to appointment PY, and I have a view called create appointment view, and I'm stating here that it requires the scope create appointment. And whenever the request is received as part of the request JWT token decoding process, the scopes attribute will be extracted, and we'll check is that scope within the list of scopes available for that token. So that's just bringing things back to the role-based authentication. But you know, You could have a different set of scopes per view, which I have included down here. So, there's an update appointment scope. You can have like a manage appointment scope. You can feel free to, customize that as, whatever way you feel like's needed. And again, you can check all this out on the GitHub repository. It's also, I'm just thinking as well that one of the things is that you have in Django the concept of object permissions. So where you want to check if a certain Django model object or database row belongs to a specific user. And this is something that is also supported within my permissions class. So an example of this is that you don't want one patient to have the ability to modify the records of another patient, but you would want a staff member to have that ability. So as part of these permission classes, it also has that ability. So not only the scopes are being checked, but also the object level permissions too. But that's just a kind of quick overview of how the authentication is coming through and being handled on my Django REST API. And feel free to check it out on the GitHub.